The crumpled $10 note and 8 silver dollars in Silas Rowan's fist were supposed to keep his ranch alive. By sunset, he would spend them buying a girl in a saloon. And it would be the only reason he survived the year. Mercy Ford, Idaho Territory, 1886, had not seen real rain in 97 days. The horses stood with their heads low. The river had pulled back from its own banks. Even the dust seemed tired. Silas had come into town for seed barley, lamp oil, and a length of new rope. He had counted the money 3 times before leaving the ranch, then once more outside the mercantile, because counting it made the problem feel smaller. It did not. $18 was not enough to save anything. It was only enough to postpone losing it. Then the laughter came from the Buckhorn Saloon. It was not drinking laughter. It was meaner than that. The kind men used when they wanted the whole street to know that somebody weaker had been cornered. Silas was not a man who entered saloons any more. Not since Clara died, and not since the house grew so quiet that even the ticking clock seemed to accuse him of staying alive. But that laughter hooked into him and pulled and pulled. Inside, the room smelled of whiskey, sweat, tobacco, and sun-baked wool. Men crowded around an overturned peach crate as if a prize bull stood on it. But there was no bull. There was a young Chinese woman standing barefoot on the crate, her hands held tight against her ribs. She could not have been 20. Her dress was torn at one sleeve and stiff with trail dust. Her black hair had been chopped unevenly, as if someone had done it with a knife instead of scissors. Her face was small and gray with exhaustion, but her eyes were what stopped Silas. They were not pleading. Pleading still expects an answer. Her eyes had gone past that. They stared at the floor as if the wood beneath her feet was the last place left in the world where she could hide. Boone Harker, a freight boss with a red neck and a laugh like a mule braying, slapped the side of the crate. "Found her near the grade camp," he announced. "No papers, no family, no English. I got no use for her on a wagon line. Start me at 12. The room burst open with comments and jokes. Someone offered 13. Another said she looked too thin to lift a wash kettle. Harker grinned wider, because cruelty always sounds clever to men who are already safe. Silas felt the money in his fist. Seed barley, rope, lamp oil, winter salt. A ranch with 36 thirsty head, and a well that coughed sand by noon. At the back corner table sat Hollis Rusk, the richest cattleman in the valley, clean-shaven and cool in a black broadcloth coat despite the heat. Rusk owned the upper ditch, the best spring, the mercantile debt of half the town, and the patience of a spider. He watched the bidding with the mild interest of a man who had never had to choose between conscience and survival. 15, someone called. Harker leaned toward the girl. She did not move. 15, he said. I paid more for a cracked axle. Look at her hands. Small, yes. Small hands can scrub. Silas thought of Clara then, not as she had looked in the bed at the end, but as she had stood once in their doorway holding a shotgun on a drunk who had kicked their dog. Clara had been gentle with anything helpless, but she had never mistaken gentleness for weakness. Silas opened his hand. One soft banknote, 8 silver dollars, his last margin between debt and ruin. He stepped forward. The room noticed all at once. Men turned. Chairs scraped. Boone Harker squinted at him. One had lived 3 miles outside Mercy Ford for 12 years and had spoken fewer words than most men spent before breakfast. Grief had made him private. Poverty had made him smaller. His sudden movement had the force of a door opening in a sealed room. 18, Silas said. The saloon went quiet enough for the flies at the window to sound loud. Then Harker smiled. "Well now," he said, "the widower's lonely after all." A roar rolled through the room. Silas did not answer it. He set the banknote on the bar, then the 8 silver dollars, one by one, each coin landing with a hard, bright sound. He looked up at the young woman and pointed, not to himself, but to the open door. She did not understand. Of course she did not. To her, he was only another white man in a room full of them. Another pair of hands, another decision made over her head. So Silas stepped away from the crate. He moved his hands slowly, palms open. He pointed again to the doorway, to the stripe of hot sunlight beyond the saloon floor. Then he backed up another step, leaving space between them. He would not touch her, not unless she chose to move. The men laughed harder at that. Harker spat and called him soft. Rusk smiled into his glass as if he had just watched a fool sign a paper without reading it. For a long moment the girl stood frozen. Then her eyes lifted to Silas's face. She saw sunburned skin, a gray beard, shoulders bent from work, and a sorrow so old it had become part of his posture. She did not see safety, not yet, but she saw the doorway. She stepped down from the crate. The whole saloon jeered as she followed Silas into the street. Those jeers followed them to his wagon. They followed them past the mercantile, past the hitching rail, past 2 women who turned their faces away because it was easier than asking what they had just allowed. Silas climbed onto the wagon bench. The young woman sat beside him, pressed as far from him as the board allowed. He did not ask her name. He did not try to explain. It was 8 miles of heat and Wheel Creek and the slow clop of his old mare, Juniper. Halfway there, he realized what everyone in town would say by morning, that Silas Rowan had bought himself a Chinese girl. The thought sickened him so badly he almost stopped the wagon and told her to run. But run where? Back to Mercy Ford? Back to the freight camps? Back to men like Harker? So he kept driving. His ranch looked worse in the late light than it had that morning. The south field was cracked into plates. The corral dust lay ankle deep. The house, once white, had weathered to the color of old bone. Clara's kitchen garden, the one Silas had promised to keep alive, hung wilted behind a fence of sagging rails. He helped the woman down from the wagon with a touch so brief it barely counted as touch. She flinched anyway. Inside the house, he showed her the small back room that had once held Clara's quilting frame. There was a cot, a wash basin, and one clean blanket. Silas pointed to the cot, then to her. He pointed to the door and spread his hands, meaning it would not be locked. She stared at him. He left bread, beans, and a tin cup of water on the little table. Then he went out and sat on the porch until the dark came up from the draws. He had no seed, no rope, no lamp oil. One more mouth to feed, a ranch going dry under his boots. And yet the room behind him felt less empty than the whole house had felt in 2 years. The next 7 days passed in careful silence. Silas rose before sunup, carried water from the old well, and split the chores around the heat. He left food where she could take it without being watched. He learned her name on the 4th morning when he touched his own chest and said, "Silas." Then he pointed to her. She hesitated so long, he thought she would not answer. "May," she whispered. Just one syllable, small as a match in the dark. May spent most of her time near windows, the well, the cattle, the cracked field, the dry creek bed beyond the pasture. She watched Silas carry bucket after bucket of cloudy water and pour most of it where it did the least good. On the 8th morning, the old well gave up a rope's worth of mud. Silas leaned over the stone curb and listened. Nothing answered from below. No echo, no splash, just the dull smell of wet clay dying. He rode to Mercy Ford that afternoon with a list in his pocket and no money to honor it. Hollis Rusk was waiting outside the mercantile as if the street had grown him there. "Rowan," Rusk said, pleasant as a banker's pen. "You made an unusual investment." Silas tied Juniper to the rail. "She is not an investment." "No?" Rusk smiled. "Then she is an expense. Those are worse." Silas said nothing. Rusk tipped his hat back and looked toward the brown hills. "This drought will finish half the valley before frost, but it need not finish you. I will buy your place now. Fair price, enough for you to start over where the ground still forgives a man." "The place is not for sale." "Everything is for sale under a dry sky." Rusk took one step closer. His voice lowered. "You are behind at the mercantile, behind on feed, behind on sense. And now you have brought home a person the law does not much care to protect. Be careful, Silas. A man can lose more than land when he insists on being noble." Silas's hands tightened, but he kept them at his sides. Rusk wanted anger. Anger made poor men easy to handle. Silas bought a small sack of flour on credit he did not deserve, and rode home under a sky the color of tin. When he reached the ranch, May was in Clara's dead garden. At first he thought she was stealing water from the washtub. Then he stopped and looked properly. She had cut strips from a ruined flour sack and twisted them into narrow wicks. Had old cans, cracked bowls, and broken jars beside the tomato vines. From the dishpan drain she had scratched shallow channels through the dirt, each one no wider than 2 fingers. The water did not run loose any more. It crept. It soaked slowly into cloth, into soil, into roots. The squash leaves nearest the channel had lifted. Silas stood there with the flour sack still over his shoulder. For weeks he had watched water disappear into dust. May had made the dust hold it. She looked up at him, expecting perhaps a shout. Silas set down the flour and knelt beside the little channels. The engineering was simple enough for a child to see, and clever enough to shame a grown man. Nothing wasted, nothing hurried, every drop made to work twice. May pointed to the dishpan, then to the plants, then to the far north pasture. Silas followed her hand. There, on a rise he had never valued because it sat too high and too rocky for plowing, stood a ragged line of willows. Not cottonwoods by the creek where any fool would look. Willows on a dry bench of land where no water should have been. Their leaves were dusty, but they were alive, greener than anything else on the ranch. May made a digging motion. Silas frowned. "The creek is down there." He pointed to the low ground. Her head hard. She tapped her own chest, then tapped the earth, then drew a line in the air beneath the surface. Under. That was what she meant. That night, Silas lit 2 lamps for the first time since Clara's funeral. Lamp cleared the kitchen table and dusted it with flour, because flour showed marks better than old wood. With one finger he drew the well, the creek, and the pasture. May watched his rough map, then shook her head. She drew mountains first, then a river. Then she drew a second line splitting away from it, not over the land, but beneath it. She pushed her finger under the flour and raised it again at the willow rise. Silas stared at the map. He knew fences. He knew cattle weight by the set of a hip. He knew a storm 2 hours before it crossed the ridge. But he had never been taught to read trees as witnesses. May had. With gestures, drawings, and a few words between them, her story came in pieces. A village in Guangdong where dry terraces had taught people to save water like coin. A father who watched plants more closely than clouds. Railroad work promised in America. A blast in a cut through the mountains. Men who took what was left. Silas felt shame spread through him, quiet and heavy. He had thought of May as someone rescued from a crate. She was more than that. She was a person who carried maps no white man in Mercy Ford had thought to ask for. The next morning, Silas took his shovel to the willow rise. By noon, 3 riders stopped along the fence to laugh. By afternoon, word had reached town that the old widower was digging for water on a hill because a foreign girl had pointed at it. On the second day, Hollis Rusk came himself. He stood at the rim of the shallow pit, immaculate boots inches from the dust Silas had thrown out. "You will break your back before you find a teacup," Rusk said. Silas kept digging. Rusk's gaze shifted toward the house. May stood in the shade of the doorway, still as a post. "I have changed my offer," Rusk said. "I have changed my offer," Rusk said. "Not for the land, for her." The shovel stopped. Rusk smiled faintly. "Your store debt disappears. Your feed note disappears. I will even send 2 wagons of water by morning. She can show my men whatever little tricks she knows. On my property, her knowledge will be useful." Silas climbed out of the pit slowly. "She is not mine to sell." Rusk's smile thinned. "You paid Boone Harker in front of witnesses." "I paid a thief to open his hand." "That is not how town will tell it." Town can tell it crooked. Rusk stepped closer. Listen carefully. By Saturday, the mercantile note comes due. When you fail to pay, I will take the store claim to the marshal. After that, this ranch becomes a legal matter, and legal matters favor men who can afford paper. He glanced once more at May. Pride is expensive, Silas. So is pity. After he rode away, the ranch seemed to hold its breath. Silas stood with the shovel in his hands. He could save himself in one sentence. He could call Rusk back. He could hand May over and keep Clara's house, the cattle, the grave under the cedar tree. May stepped from the doorway and walked toward him. Her face held no plea. That made it worse. She knew what he had been offered. She also knew what kind of world made that offer sound practical. Silas looked past her to the willows trembling in the heat. Then he drove the shovel into the ground again. For 5 days he dug. The pit went from knee-deep to shoulder-deep. The dirt changed from powder to clay, then to gravel that jarred his wrists. Blisters opened across his palms. His shirt stiffened with salt. Each evening May washed his hands in a cupful of cloudy water and wrapped the worst places in strips of clean cloth. They still had no shared language worth naming, but a language grew anyway. A cup set near his boot meant rest. Beside the pit meant dig wider. May's hand flat in the air meant wait, listen, feel the ground before striking. On Friday, Juniper stumbled at the trough. 2 calves bawled all night. The old well gave nothing. On Saturday morning, a deputy rode out with Rusk's paper folded in his coat. He tacked the notice to Silas's porch post while Rusk waited on horseback near the gate. The ranch had 5 days. Rusk looked at the deep hole on the rise and laughed softly. Still chasing ghosts underground? Silas said, "Some ghosts know where they are buried." Rusk did not like that. His eyes narrowed, but he turned his horse and rode away. That afternoon, the shovel hit stone. Not gravel, stone. A flat shelf of it, hard and pale, just below the clay. Silas chipped at it until sparks jumped from the shovel edge. Nothing shifted. The hidden river, if it existed at all, was locked beneath rock. By dusk, he could no longer lift his arms. He sank down inside the pit, back against the wall, and pressed both bleeding hands into his lap. Above him, the sky bruised purple. A wind moved over the dry grass without cooling anything. He had believed because she believed. Now, belief seemed cruel. "May," he called, not loudly. She appeared at the rim. In one hand she held a lantern. The other, Clara's old garden hoe, the small one with the narrow iron point. Silas shook his head. No. He pointed to the stone. Finished. May lowered the lantern into the pit. Then she pointed to the wall behind him. Not the floor, the wall. Silas turned. In the lamplight, a dark thread ran through the clay about a foot above the stone shelf. Thin as a bootlace, easy to miss. It was not wet enough to drip, but it was darker than everything around it. May climbed down into the pit before he could stop her. She pressed 2 fingers to the dark seam. then touch those fingers to her lips. Water, not below the stone, beside it. The land changed in his mind. He had been trying to punch straight down like every well digger he had ever known. May had been following the way water moved when rock told it no. They dug sideways. For the first hour, nothing happened. Then the clay softened. Then the shovel came back black. Then the wall sighed. A bead formed. Another followed. Then a small, cold runnel slipped down the pit wall and pooled around Silas's boot. He dropped the shovel. May laughed once, a sound so startled and bright it almost broke him. By morning, water stood 4 inches deep in the bottom of the pit. Clear water, cold water. Water that tasted of stone and dark earth, not mud. Silas sat on the ground and wept with his face in both hands. Not because the ranch was saved, not yet, because for the first time in 2 years, the world had answered him. 12 weeks later, Mercy Ford looked at the Rowan place as if it had risen from the dead. The new well had been stoned and covered. A narrow wooden trough carried water toward the garden. Channels, wicks, and shallow basins spread it through the south field without wasting a bucket. The cattle filled out. Clara's garden returned in green layers. Beans, squash, onions, late corn with tassels lifting into the autumn light. Men who had laughed at the hill well came to the fence and pretended they had only been passing. Silas sold 6 head in October at a price no drought-finned herd could touch. With that money, he walked into the Mercy Ford Mercantile, while Hollis Rusk stood by the counter reading his own ledger. Silas laid coins down until the debt was gone. Rusk did not speak. The clerk did not breathe. The men near the stove stared at the money, then at Silas, then at Rusk's face as his smile vanished piece by piece. Paper had failed him. Water had not. That evening, Silas returned home with a second paper in his coat, on the porch, mending a sleeve by the last light. She looked up when he sat beside her. He unfolded the document carefully. It was a deed signed by the territorial clerk and witnessed in town before Rusk could whisper poison into it. Silas had marked half the Rowan ranch into May's name, not as charity, not as repayment, as truth on paper for what had already become true in the dirt. May studied the writing she could not yet read. Silas pointed to his own name, then to hers, then to the house, the garden, the cattle, the well on the willow rise. He drew a line down the center of his palm, then closed both hands together. Half, whole, partners. May understood slowly. When she did not cry the way Silas expected. She held the paper against her chest with both hands and looked out over the land until the dark gathered in the furrows. Then she spoke one of the English words he had taught her. Home. Silas nodded. The word seemed to settle into the porch boards, into the garden soil, into the deep, cold seam under the hill. He had walked into the Buckhorn Saloon thinking $18 was the price of mercy. He had been wrong. It was the price of being taught that a person can be buried under other people's judgment and still carry a hidden river. The dry ground had not been empty. Neither had she.